Game number 2 of the World Chess Championship. We have Ding Liren up one game in the match playing with the white pieces. What are we going to see in this one? Will Ding press for another advantage out of the opening? Will we see players fight? Or are they going to be content going for the draw? We see e4 by Ding Liren, e5 by Gukesh, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, d3. This is the Joko Pianismo variation. It's a slow line, super solid. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a drawish line. Players can still play for the win in this variation. Knight f6, and now we have what's called the four knights after knight to c3. We have kind of an interesting dynamic here because the players are playing an opening that is known to be popular among beginners. The four knights is the opening when all four of these knights develop towards the center after the pawns on e4 and e5 come out. And both sides are getting all their minor pieces developed, right? Notice how these are all in perfect placement. This bishop's going to come out soon, either to e3 or to g5. And black's going to do the same thing. d6 with bishop to g4 or bishop to e6. Pawn to a6. This is a trendy move at the top levels. One thing I noticed in the database, though, is white is only scoring 46% in this position. Usually white scores around 53, 54%, depending on the variation. Pawn to a4. This prevents the potential for black to play pawn to b5 and also grabs a little bit of space on the queen side. d6, castle. And I'm looking at the games in the database here while prepping this video, and there are quite a few games that don't end in a draw. I think it was about 50% of the games ended with a decisive result. Pawn to h6. This prevents the bishop to g5 pin. So nice kind of quiet move, prophylactic, not allowing the opponent to put this bishop on the optimal square. So Ding says, all right, I'm going to play bishop to e3. And at first glance, you might be thinking, well, isn't this a bad decision? This gives white double pawns, right? Well, the double pawns have some advantages. The pawn on e3 defends d4 and defends f4. Those are both squares that this knight would love to get to. Knight to d4 right away, for example. Sometimes you see a knight reroute over to the king side and try to plant on f4. Well, both of those squares are covered. The pawn on e3 could also potentially support a d4 break, pawn guarding another pawn. And the most important aspect, I think, is the f-file becomes a half-open file. So Ding can actually use the doubled pawns to make his rook more active on the f-file. And there's already the bishop pointing at f7. So Gukesh decides, I'm not going to take, and I will just repeat what you did, bishop e3, and I'll play bishop to e6, playing for the symmetry. Now, Ding plays an interesting move here. He plays pawn to a5, and I'm starting to wonder if this is going to be the theme of the match. Pawn to a5 is a very AlphaZero looking move. When the AlphaZero paper was published with its games against Stockfish, people noticed right away that AlphaZero was pushing the rook pawns, the A and the H pawns. It was just pushing those up the board all the time. And Ding did this in the prior game, right? Remember we had the French defense, Ding was playing black, and he pushed his A pawn all the way up the board. It actually got to a3. So this is kind of an interesting decision. On to a5, Ding is saying, I'm going to just lock down this queen side and grab that extra space. Okay, now we see a 7-minute think by Gukesh, and he plays bishop takes c4. I think what he's saying is, okay, Mr. Champion, show me your plan to push for a win. Because after d takes c4, now Ding has these double pawns, and it's not clear how Ding makes progress, because normally what you would do is look to play c3 at some point and pawn to d4, building this big center. But with the pawn on c4, there's really no pawn breaks here for white, right? What are these pawns trying to do? Nothing. So I think the play for white is coming through having this half-open file. Can white make use of that? Now I see Gukesh castles. This was a little surprising to me, though, because I thought he might go for this. Bishop takes e3, f takes e3, giving Ding the isolated double pawns. That would be an interesting decision, right? Could Ding make use of having these two half-open files, f and d, or will all of these pawns highlighted in red become weaknesses, the sets of double pawns? It's possible, though, that maybe Gukesh thought this position was too passive, right? Players at high levels think a lot about the initiative and piece activity. And if we recall in game one, Ding had the initiative the whole game. And I think that was a big reason that he won. And also Gukesh D overextended his pawns. Well, look at Gukesh's pawns here. He is making sure not to overextend any of them. And in this position, I think Ding is starting to grab the initiative because the pawn weaknesses give Ding extra play with the pieces. So my feeling is Gukesh wants to avoid this, but normally I would think bishop takes e3 is a strong move. So Gukesh is saying, I'm not going to give you the initiative in this game if I can help it. Bishop takes c5 by Ding, d takes c5, b3. And the computer gives white just the very tiniest of advantages here, right around 0.1, because now the pawns are symmetric again. But Ding has a little bit extra space. That's the big difference here. And in the end game, it is nice to grab some extra space. Queen takes d1, rook takes d1, rook a to d8. Both sides are fighting for this important open file, but Ding does have to keep an eye on this pawn on a5. Knight takes a5 is potentially a threat. There are some lines, like we're going to look at in a little bit, where you could sacrifice that pawn. Actually, let's look at it now. What if white plays... So in the game, rook d to c1 was played, avoiding the rook trade. What if white plays knight to e1? This is interesting to me. Rook takes, leaving the pawn undefended on a5. Knight takes a5, and now knight to d3, double attacking the pawns. Knight to d7, trying to guard both of them. And now knight to d5, attacking this pawn. Okay, so let's say c6 is played. Because Ding is starting to get an advantage in this line. It's right around 0.3 at low depths. If you let Stockfish run forever, all these positions are still equal. But it's showing a 0.3 or a 0.5 even is starting to show Ding could push for something in this variation. Now there's knight to e7 check. Let's put the king on h7. And then knight to b2. And this knight's heading to a4, attacking this pawn. This knight is out on the rim on a5, hitting two pawns that are not attackable. That's the difference. And this position is getting a little bit tough. The rook on d1 hits the knight, right? So white's going to control the open file. Both knights are going to be a little bit more active than black's. So potentially this was a way to push harder. But rook to c1, rook d to c1 was played in the game. Now we see knight to d4, threatening knight takes f3 check. And Ding probably doesn't want those double pawns. It's not a huge deal, but he decides to move the knight back, guarding the c2 pawn, which is attacked by this knight. Rook to d6, doubling on the file. King f1, g6, rook d1. So the knight on e1 guards this pawn. Now Ding contests the open file. And notice that the pawn on a5 is not being attacked currently by black, but this knight on d4 could always drop back to attack the pawn. Rook f to d8, pawn to f3. I like this move. It's solidifying the pawn on e4, which is being attacked. So now this knight is free to move. It doesn't have to defend e4. Also, the king sits pretty nicely on f2. King g7, king f2. And let's compare the kings here. The king on f2 is one square closer to the action. The action's kind of happening in the middle here, down this d file. The king on g7 is an extra file further away from the action. So that's just a very tiny advantage for Ding Liren. And Ding also has the tiny advantage of this pawn being more extended. A little bit more queenside space. Sometimes an advanced pawn in the endgame can give you that extra potential to promote the pawn. And now we see h5 by Gukesh. I think he's looking to gain some kingside space. Just like we talked about with the a pawn. He wants to get a little bit something going over on the kingside. But I'm sure he's still thinking about that game number one. Even though there's no queens on the board, he doesn't want to overextend too much. Knight e2. Hitting this knight. H4 was also very interesting there, just as a way to shut down the h5 pawn. Knight c6. And here Gukesh is essentially saying, okay, now you can't make progress. I'm attacking your pawn on a5, creating a threat of rook takes d1. What are you going to do? Knight c3 played. Now here I was wondering, could Gukesh play rook takes d1? Because the rook on a1 is tied down to the defense here. And if rook takes d1, knight takes d1, this looks really good for black, winning that pawn. Here's the variation Ding had in mind. After rook takes d1, knight takes d1 first, keeping the pawn guarded on a5. And it looks like rook to d2 check is a strong move for Gukesh. But Ding has this nice response. King e3 attacking the rook, and the knight on e1 defends both pawns on the second rank. And there's nowhere for this rook to go on the second rank safely, so it just has to retreat. So it looked like at first glance, maybe knight to c3 was allowing the a-pawn to drop, but Ding has everything covered. A knight back to d4, knight e2, knight back to c6, knight c3, knight to d4, draw agreed. So neither side could make progress in this position. I think both players are going to be happy with this game. Gukesh got out of it with a draw. Can head into game number 3 tomorrow with the white pieces and can try to figure out a way to push for a win. And Ding Liren got to figure out what is Gukesh D going to play against 1e4, because this might not be Ding Liren's main weapon, but it's just a little piece of data. And he got to show a couple interesting ideas in terms of how he's going to play against Gukesh. The offer of the trade right here after a5, the offer of this trade, I think, tells a lot. Ding is saying, I'm going to grab this little queenside space, and I'm going to allow double pawns, knowing that this makes the pieces more active. And I think the theme of the match is going to be who can play for the initiative. Gukesh was definitely thinking about this when he decided to castle. He did not play bishop takes e3, because that would have gave Ding Liren this position where his pieces are even more active to compensate the pawn weaknesses. So both sides are probably happy with today's game. It was a pretty quick draw in terms of move count, but the players did spend quite a bit of time getting to the end result. So it wasn't like they had just prearranged this draw. There was still a little shuffling going on, and neither side felt like they had enough to play for the win. So if you guys like these recaps, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, leave a comment, and I will see you for tomorrow's recap with Gukesh having the white pieces. Thanks for watching, everybody.